Something strange is quietly unfolding behind the front lines of this war, and most people haven't stopped to ask the obvious question. Why would Russia treat its most controversial prisoners with anything resembling dignity? Every single day, frustration is bubbling up across Russian military circles and online communities. The source of that frustration isn't battlefield losses or supply chain problems. It's the way captured Azov fighters are being treated at hospitals in Donetsk. Soldiers, commentators, and military bloggers are openly expressing their discontent, feeling like the men who spent months holding Mariupol are now being rewarded with comfortable beds and medical attention, while Russian troops who bled for that city are being pushed aside. One of the most vocal critics has been Igor Girkin, a former military commander with a significant following, who went as far as publishing multiple posts condemning the Russian command for rushing to redeploy Russian medical personnel just to make room for Azov prisoners of war. Now, let's be honest about what we actually know, because the full picture remains murky. Most of what is leaked out about the condition of these prisoners has come not from Russian officials, but from the Ukrainian side. The wife of Azov unit commander Denis Prokopenko went public saying her husband was doing reasonably well under the circumstances. That single detail, coming from the family of a man Russia had spent months demonizing, speaks volumes. Think about that for a second. The Azov battalion was essentially the centerpiece of Russia's entire justification for launching this invasion in the first place. The narrative constructed around them was carefully designed. They were presented as the face of what Russia called the denazification mission, the embodiment of everything the Kremlin claimed it needed to destroy. For nearly 3 months,
Azov fighters held their ground inside the Azovstal steel plant, while Russian and Donetsk People's Republic forces hammered the city from every direction. Hundreds, and by most estimates probably thousands, of soldiers from both the Russian military and the DPR forces died trying to break through the city's defenses. And after all of that, after all the death, the rubble, the political theater, the fighters who surrendered are being housed in hospitals, receiving treatment, and by some accounts, doing just fine. That is a remarkable contrast to the tone that was coming out of Russian and DPR-aligned media just weeks earlier. Spokespeople and lower-level officials were practically falling over themselves to announce that there would be no mercy for the fighters holed up underground in Azovstal. The language was unambiguous. These were not men who would be shown any quarter. And yet, here we are. Internal frustration within the DPR is not just simmering, it's beginning to crack the surface. A Telegram channel called Soldiers' Truth, which posts from inside Russian military circles, published a detailed account on May 27, 2022, describing the situation on the ground at the 15th Hospital in Donetsk. The post makes several pointed accusations, and while it's clearly written from a perspective hostile to how things are being managed, it gives us a rare window into the internal friction playing out right now. According to that account, prisoners are reportedly being provided with physical therapy and massage treatment during their recovery, services that the post's author argues cross the line from basic life-saving care into full rehabilitation. The distinction matters to them because, as the Post claims, their own wounded fighters were being denied equivalent treatment during the same period. The reason given was that the DPR's Ministry of Health had issued a ban on hospitalizing DPR troops at the 15th hospital starting May 16th. That ban, according to the source, was still in effect at the time of writing. Russian and DPR soldiers were being discharged, while no new admissions were being accepted. And in the meantime, more captured Ukrainian fighters were being brought in. The numbers described paint a vivid picture. The Azov prisoners were no longer just being kept in a separate annex of the hospital. They had expanded into the main building, occupying wards on the 3rd and 5th floors. By the time this post was written, roughly a third of all available beds in that facility were occupied by captured Ukrainian fighters. men that the same Russian government had publicly labeled as enemies of civilization not long before. What makes the situation even more charged is the attitude some of these prisoners allegedly displayed. According to the source, several fighters, when asked directly whether they intended to return to combat if they were released in a prisoner exchange, reportedly answered yes, without hesitation. Whether that's accurate, exaggerated for rhetorical effect, or completely fabricated to stir outrage among Russian readers is impossible to verify from the outside. But the fact that it's being published and circulated tells us something about the mood. People inside these communities feel humiliated. They feel like the sacrifices made to take Mariupol are being undermined by decisions made at a level far above them. The post goes on to describe another consequence of this tension that's easy to overlook but potentially serious. Medical staff are leaving. A dressing nurse had already resigned, and with only 4 such specialists remaining, 2 in each neurosurgery ward, losing even 1 more would mean losing a quarter of that critical expertise. The author asks pointedly, if the remaining 3 leave, who teaches the next wave of new hires? Trial and error on patients? It's the kind of practical detail that reveals just how fragile the situation on the ground actually is.
The source then lays out a series of specific demands. Lift the ban on admitting DPR fighters to the main hospital building and give them at least half the beds. Transfer only the most critically injured prisoners to rehabilitation centers when their lives are genuinely at risk. Hand off medical supply responsibility to the Red Cross and move the less critical prisoners to a psychiatric facility in Petrovka or to detention centers once they've stabilized, with the Red Cross providing medical support there instead. The final lines of the post carry an air of resignation. Within a month, there would be no DPR wounded left in this hospital at all, just a prison ward for captured Ukrainian forces, sitting conveniently on the outskirts of Donetsk, with no homegrown medical staff to run it. Now, step back from the specific grievances in that post for a moment. Even accounting for the obvious propaganda elements, the claims about prisoners bragging openly about returning to fight, the loaded language used to describe them, what if the core of it is accurate? What if Azov fighters are genuinely receiving quality medical care in Donetsk? What does that actually tell us about what Russia is trying to do here? Layer that together with something else that's been happening simultaneously. Alexei Arestovich, the deputy head of the Ukrainian presidential office, has been making public statements framing Russia as the side pushing for quick military results in Donbass, while positioning Ukraine as the party willing to keep fighting and Russia as the reluctant peacemaker facing a looming global food crisis. It sounds almost absurd given the context, but that narrative is clearly being cultivated for a specific audience: Western governments and international institutions. And suddenly the picture starts to come into focus. If you're Russia and you want to reposition yourself on the world stage as a rational actor willing to engage in diplomacy, what's one of the most powerful things you can do? You treat your most notorious prisoners well. You let the Red Cross in. You make the story about your restraint, your humanity, your willingness to follow the rules of war, even when dealing with people you've spent months calling irredeemable. It's a calculated image play. The Azov fighters, for all the political weight they carry inside Russian domestic narratives, may be far more valuable to the Kremlin alive, healthy, and holding well than they ever would be as martyrs or statistics. The optics of humane treatment, broadcast to European capitals and international observers, could serve as a bridge back toward negotiations. And as unlikely as a diplomatic resolution feels right now, Russia clearly hasn't abandoned the idea of eventually presenting itself as ready for the table. There's one more piece of this puzzle worth paying close attention to. Back on May 17th, Russian prosecutors formally requested that a court designate Azov as a terrorist organization. If that designation were granted, it would carry potentially serious legal consequences for the prisoners. Their status under international law could shift dramatically, and the protections normally afforded to prisoners of war might no longer apply. That court ruling was originally scheduled for May 26th. It didn't happen. The decision was pushed back to late June. The delay is interesting. It could mean many things. It could be bureaucratic. It could be a deliberate signal of uncertainty. It could be a pressure tactic designed to hang over the prisoners' heads without ever quite landing. But the timing of that delay, sitting right alongside the reports of relatively good treatment in Donetsk hospitals, suggests at minimum that no final decision has been made about what role these prisoners are going to play in whatever comes next. And that ambiguity is the most telling detail of all. Because one thing is simply true as a matter of logic. You do not invest real resources in healing your most politically charged enemies, displacing your own wounded in the process, just to lock those enemies away forever or eliminate them quietly down the line. That calculus doesn't add up. It doesn't serve the narrative, it doesn't serve the resources spent, and it doesn't serve whatever audience Russia is clearly trying to perform for right now. Something is being set up. What exactly? We don't yet know. But the decisions being made around the Azov prisoners, the medical care, the court delay, the management of international optics, all point toward a deliberate strategy that goes well beyond simply processing prisoners of war. Russia is building toward something with these men, and the answer to what that is will likely arrive sooner than most people expect.